Welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens. And first of all, I would like to thank all of you, specifically everybody who subscribed. By the way, if you haven't done so, you can subscribe now to my channel about China. But everybody who subscribed and gave in some comments or wrote some comments on any of my videos, I love it. I try to answer as much as I can. And we can have this dialogue. I really enjoy it. I'm learning as well. This week, I'm going to talk about something that some people, quite a lot of people actually, have been raising as a topic. And this is also an invitation for anyone. If you have a topic about China that you're interested in, shoot it and I will try and see if I can put it into my planning of one of the next weeks. But the topic that I want to discuss today is one about the aging population of China. And the question I would like to answer is China growing old before they're growing rich? So can China, or will China, grow old before it grows rich? A lot of people think so. The aging population in China is one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problem, that the country has to face. And a lot of Western media talk about the fact that this aging population is not a quick fix like the one-child policy where you can stop having new babies being born. No, you're stuck with the aging population, the older population, and you need to care for them, specifically in the Chinese cultural context. So how are they going to solve that problem? Now, to understand the one-child policy, which is related to it, you have to go back in time. 1953, that's the first time, 4 years after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, that family planning was introduced. What it meant primarily was to explain to all the couples and women in China about anti-conception and fertility programs. And so that got introduced everywhere, and so the fertility rate went down. But in 1979, we had the one-child policy, and this lasted until 2015. We've all heard about that very controversial topic, but this was all about couples in the city that could only have one child. Outside of the cities, in the countryside, or minorities, they could have 2 or more children, but not in the cities where everybody wanted to live. 2015 it was stopped. Before that was like a little bit more flexible, like if you didn't have any siblings, you could get a second child. But only after 2016 it's now the 2-child policy. And so this is still a policy and there's still limitations. So you can't just have as many children as you want. But why did China do it? Well, primarily they did it because China had too many people. Still has too many people. If you look at 1960s, I mean, it was incredible. The women on average had 5 to 6 children. 5 to 6 children, imagine that in a country like China where there was still hunger at that time. And so, of course, this fertility program was very important, specifically the anti-conception. And so it went down very quickly after it all got introduced. And in 1979, when the one-child policy got introduced, it got below the threshold of 2.1. And this threshold is very important because that shows whether a population is growing if it's above 2.1 on average or below 2.1. So if a woman has less than 2 children on average over the whole country, all the women, then actually the whole population is starting to decline. And so from 1979, China went from 2.5 very quickly to 1.5. And today it stands at 1.3. Now you could say this is great news. But the problem is we now have an aging population and there's not enough babies being born. And if you look at the last 4 years, I mean, last year was only 12 million babies. This will go below 10 million for a country with more than 1.4 billion people. This is a real problem. And it's not just the fertility rate. You also have to look at what we call the median. And the median is actually 38.8 for China. What that means is that 50% of the population of China is older than 38.8 years, almost 39 years. And 50% is younger than 39 years. It means it's becoming an older population. And you see the same in other countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea. You see as well in Western Europe. America is doing a little bit better. They're only at 38.3 and their fertility is much better as well. So they're actually in a much better shape than China is. And China could be getting into the shape of Japan, which was disastrous for its economy. We'll talk about that later. But this is something to watch. Now, if you look at the census, this happens every 10 years, and it started in 1952, that the first census was taken the year after, 1953, and China calculated that at that time China had 582 million people. Now, the whole world had about 2.5 billion, so 1 out of 5 were Chinese at that point. And then every 10 years there was another census, except in the 70s with the Cultural Revolution, of course, they didn't do it. But you could see the shape very clear being a triangle at that point. And then later on, in the 80s, when they started doing, and in the 90s, you saw the shape change into a triangle, or you could call it a diamond shape. And even in 1982, just after the one-child policy was introduced, you could really see that China had already doubled its number of population or people within just 30 years' time. So the one-child policy, controversial or not, we have to think about it that in 30 years it went from 580 to 1 billion people, and if that would be another 30 years, another 1 billion, double again, then today we would be at more than 2 billion people. China didn't want to let that happen, and that is the reason it started. But this shape got more and more like a diamond. Every census, every 10 years, you could see this change very much. And the last one that was done just this week on May 11th, you see that there's 1.411 billion Chinese living in the country right now. And the thing that you see in the red circle, that is actually the 1 ren, which means 10,000 people, because Chinese count per 10,000, not per thousands. And that's why this number looks a little bit weird, but it's 1,411,780,000 people. That's the count today. And over the past 10 years, it only increased by 70 million people, or 72 million, which is very, very small for a 1.4 billion population. That's like 0.53% of increase. So not a lot. So China's population is not growing anymore. Might sound good because you don't want this huge population, but at the same time, you got an aging population. And the other thing is about the gender. It's an interesting topic to look at as well, because there's always been a preference for boys instead of girls in China to continue the name of the family and other reasons. But today you see this growing more and more closer to each other. It's like a 51% versus 49%. So it's getting closer to each other. That's a positive evolution. Now, this has to do as well, of course, with the second child, but it also has to do with the mindset of the Chinese that has changed over the years. Now, if you look at the age distribution chart, that's the most interesting to understand the aging problem of China. There's 18% of Chinese that are kids, children, between 0 and 14 years old. And then there's about 18, a little bit more, percent that are older than 60 years, so old people. And the rest is all in the working category. That's 65%, 64% almost of people that are between 15 and 59 years old. Now the problem is not that, because you could say if there's 18% children and there's 18% old people, well, it's kind of in balance, right? But the issue is that the working population is declining. Last 10 years declined with 6.79%. And the aging population went up with 5.44%. And now today, there's already 264 million people above 60 years old. That's almost as many as Americans. And if you look at people above 65 years old, which really don't contribute to society much anymore in terms of labor, then you do see that there's actually already 190 million people in China today. By 2033, it will be close to 250 million. It will go up to a peak of 400 million people by 2060. And then it will decline again. But this is a huge problem if you look at that, because there's not enough working people to actually care for the aging population. Now, besides that, if you look at this working population, you can really see that 2020 is the peak. And from now on, it will really decline. But what we have to consider as well is that even today, there's still 925 million people in the working environment. So that is a lot of people, almost 1 billion people out of the 1.4 billion people are contributing to China still. I mean, it's a little bit less and it's declining fast, and from now on it will go down. But even if we look in 80 years from now, in 2100, that is at the end of the century, we see that it's 60% of the population will, 55% of the population will actually still be working, and that will be about 650 million people. So still a lot of people, even in 80 years from now. So it's a big problem, but the amount of people is still huge. But how do we have to look at that? Because people always say you have to compare with Japan. If you look at Japan, it's very clear that their economy stopped, and this is why many people say China will grow old before it grows rich, because in Japan it was clear that after 1995 there was a decline in the population, so there was many more aging population, and the working population declined, and because of that it was one of the main drivers of the economy that didn't continue to grow as it was in the 70s and before. So this is something that people are telling you should watch Japan to understand China, but I think there's difference. For me, there's 4 big differences, and maybe there's more, that I see between Japan and China to compare them, to see whether China will actually be able to deal with this better than Japan did. First, both countries were very labor intensive, but the difference is that China is the factory of the world. And so Japan was also the factory of the world for like electronics and automotive, but it was very much focused on certain markets. China is selling to everywhere and selling anything. It's very diversified, and it has its internal market that is very big as well. And so consumption can actually help this also. So a little bit different than Japan. The other thing is pension and age. If you look at the pension age that in Japan, you really see that it's at 62 years old. While in China, male is at 60 and woman at 50 for a worker, blue collar. For white collar, it's at 55 for women. And so it's still many years lower. And because of that, actually, there's still some room to actually wiggle there and to work your way through it. Japan has a bigger problem. And the other thing is the trade war. And we sometimes forget, but one of the main reasons that Japan actually didn't continue in its growth is because of a US trade war in the 80s and 90s. And US did exactly the same or very similar things to what they did to China just the past years under Trump. And for Japan, it was really a problem in semiconductors and automotive, and suddenly their industry had no more market to sell to. It was very, very difficult. It was very expensive. And so this was harming the world. But when you look at China, even with the trade war with the US, they're still exporting more and more and more. So I don't think this will stop any day soon. And then there's, of course, GDP growth. If you look at Japan, GDP growth was also like 6, 7, 8% in the 70s and then the 80s. And then suddenly it went to 2%, and it constantly hovered between 0 or even minus up to 2% and never went higher than that anymore since the 80s, 90s. While China is still growing at 6% today. So I think they at least have a decade or 2 decades to solve this huge problem. But many people say in 2035, China will have run out of money to pay all the pensions if they have to. So this has to change something. Now, the other thing is that you hear Chinese media constantly say that one of the main things to solve is this this low rate of childbirths. And so it has to do with the one-child policy that is now a two-child policy, but we have to let that go. And I think that's very, very hard. I think China will do everything they can, but I think they have some problems. And one of the issues is that people don't want more than one child anymore. Main issue that many Chinese women are giving, or families, is that the cost of living is extreme. So they don't want a second child because it's just too expensive. I kind of disagree with that statement, although the whole China actually thinks it that way. And the reason I'm saying that is because Chinese are spending 15% of their income, their household income, on their child. Well, in America, it's like 2 or 3%, in Europe, a little bit more. But I mean, if they would lower the spending on their children, they could have more children. They just don't want to because they think in this competitive environment, you need to support the children. It's their decision. Some families, is up to 50% of their household income goes to that one child. Imagine. So that's a choice, but they're making that choice. The other thing, which is definitely sure, is that I believe most Chinese women, I'm not a woman, so I can't speak for them, but I believe that most Chinese women actually feel that they grew up quite okay. And even the husbands do. They grew up as a single child, so why would they need siblings. They don't see the value. They see their lives as being quite okay during their own childhood. So one child is good, gets all the attention and gets a lot more opportunity. So that's a mental thing. The other thing is that Chinese these days, specifically young women and young men, they want to make their own choice. They don't want the family, or they don't want the government to dictate that they should actually reproduce more children. So it's about, I decide what I do with my body. And that's also something that has changed a lot over the past decade. Now, the last thing is about being alone. And a lot of women in China choose for a career, they choose for having more time, and they want to make sure that they can care for themselves when they're old themselves. And this is a difference with the past. Families in the past, they had to have children because these children had to care for the parents in some way. But Chinese these days think, if I do okay with my career alone or with a partner or married, it doesn't matter, then I actually can care for myself. I don't need children. I don't need 2 or 3 children to care for me. So there's a lot of mentality changing. And because of that, the government doesn't have an easy time to convince many Chinese to have more than one child. Now, if Chinese couples don't want to have more than one child, how is the government going to solve the aging population? Well, I think there's 4 things that China has to do. And the first thing is new policies regarding childbirth. And first of all, I think the 2-child policy needs to be completely abolished and anybody could have as many children as they want. The other thing is that I believe they need to encourage women to make it easier for them to actually bear children. And that means that they would, for example, have maternity support, but also that employers who wouldn't want to hire women because they would get pregnant, that this would be a law against that. And so a lot of things can still be done. There's even a professor in China that says Chinese government should just give 1 million renminbi, that's like $150,000 to every couple that gets an extra child, a second or a third child. And so these are crazy ideas, but maybe it's not so crazy in these times where there's such a big aging population. Now, the second thing is about the pension age. The Chinese government has already said they will increase it, but the idea now is to increase it with a few months every few years so that people don't really feel it. But that is maybe or probably not going to be fast enough. I think the Chinese government needs to really raise it much faster to the level of, for example, Japan at 62. And I know a lot of Chinese old people will be very upset about that because they've worked really hard their whole life, and so convincing them is not going to be easy, specifically because old people are respected in China, but I think there's no alternative to do it. Now, one thing I forgot to say about Japan is that Japanese people are also getting much older than Chinese. They're getting like up to 90 years old. The life expectancy is about 90 years, while in China it's about 77 years. It's growing to 79 by 2030, but that also means that this aging population, there's still some room there, but it's going very fast in China too. Now, the third thing that I think China needs to do is to look at the cost of living. Despite the fact that Chinese don't have to spend as much money on their children, that's still what they want to do. And so specifically the housing cost in many of the cities is really, really too high for most couples to give a house to their child. So the child can't buy their own house, the parents can't buy a house for them, so it becomes really a real big problem. So I think on the living cost, that is something that China needs to tackle as well. And they're looking at this for sure. But I think the biggest problem of all these policies and all these measures that China can do is the labor productivity. The labor productivity is actually very low in China compared to what it should be looking at the superpower that China is today. And that has a lot to do with the financial crisis in 2008, where there was a lot of investment from the government into state-owned enterprises and into investment that didn't really end up increasing the productivity. And so this has to go up. If it doesn't go up, basically that labor force is not giving enough money to the aging population that needs it. And so this is something innovation and automation and all this mindset change and a lot more smarter Chinese is what China needs. But that is exactly what's happening. The government is putting all the emphasis on innovation and on education. And because of that, I believe they will be able to manage all this aging population problem if they do it correctly. But the most important for me is that China is getting smarter. And what that means is that because the illiteracy rate is less than 3%, or the literacy rate is more than 97%, actually Chinese are getting smarter. There's 15% with a university degree. It means that the whole economy is now starting to become much more about the mind and much less, and the brain, and much less about the hands. And so this means that they're going into a different mode of the economy. And that is really what will save China. So in my view, education and innovation is the only thing that can save China from an aging population by increasing its productivity or labor productivity by making it much smarter and much better. And then if you service the whole world, that could really service the whole aging population in China. So I'm quite positive about it. And I do believe China will solve its aging population, but it's not going to be easy, but they will solve it because China, both the government, the companies, and the people are getting much smarter today. So I believe that the Chinese government and the country has all the tools available to solve and cope with the aging population of China. But on the other hand, I believe it's an uphill battle. And what worries me most is that the predictions of people above 65 years old was actually 12.6% of the whole population. Turned out to be 13.5%. So they miscalculated the government 1%. That means the aging population is going way faster than everybody predicted. And so this is a huge problem and something to look at. Now, these tools are available, but will they go fast enough, the government and the whole society? That is the big question, and something to watch, and maybe in 10 years from now in the next census to review at that point. Now, if you want to add anything on the comments, do so, because I probably forgot a few things, because this topic is very broad and wide, and so we can discuss and have a dialogue about other things. Do write it, do share it, so that we can talk about this into the comments. I hope you liked it, and see you next week for another episode on Pascal's China Lens.